The copper sun blazed mercilessly over the cracked earth of Dusty Fork on that sweltering August morning in 1868, 3 years after the war's end, and 2 years since the Army had abandoned Fort Clearwater. Heat waves shimmered off the sun-baked adobe walls and weathered wooden sidewalks of the frontier town, where dust devils danced between abandoned storefronts and the few remaining businesses that clung to life like desert flowers after a brief rain. At the windmill on the town's eastern edge, where wooden vanes creaked mournfully in the scorching breeze, a muddy seep barely trickled from between the foundation stones. This precious water source, fed by an underground spring that had sustained travelers since the days of the great western migrations, represented life itself in a territory where drought had claimed more lives than bullets or arrows. Kneeling beside the life-giving puddle, Honovi filled his dented tin cup with careful reverence. The 28-year-old Lakota Warrior wore the full ceremonial regalia of his fallen chief, an eagle feather war bonnet that caught the harsh light like captured sunbeams, intricate beadwork across his buckskin shirt, and painted symbols of honor that told the story of battles fought and victories won. The headdress was not his by right of birth or deed, but by sacred duty. Chief White Thunder lay wrapped in buffalo hide 3 days' ride north, waiting for burial in the ancestral grounds where his father's fathers rested beneath the endless sky. Following the old trader traces south toward the Platte and the Arkansas, he had crossed into Colorado on a messenger's errand, carrying a wrapped ceremonial bonnet and news to allies before the trouble found him. Across the narrow seep separated by perhaps 6 feet of mud-caked ground, a young white woman crouched like a wounded animal driven to ground. Her calico prairie dress, once blue as summer cornflowers, hung in tatters around her slight frame. Auburn hair that had once been carefully braided now fell in matted strands around a face streaked with trail dust and something darker, the residue of smoke from burned dreams and buried hopes. Eliza Bauer was 19 years old, though hardship had aged her beyond her years. Her knuckles bled from fresh scrapes, the kind that came from clawing at rope burns or fighting against restraints. A thumb-shaped bruise marred the pale skin of her throat, purple and angry against the morning light, testament to rough hands and cruel intentions. She watched the Lakota Warrior with eyes the color of storm clouds gathering on the horizon. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the tremor of desperation, held in check by pure will. "Show me," she said each word, cutting through the desert silence like a blade drawn across leather. "How to use my hands." The morning wind gusted across the mesa, whipping up a distant wall of dust that rolled toward them like smoke from some vast prairie fire. Within that swirling curtain of grit and shadow, 3 mounted figures appeared on the horizon, their rifles glinting in the harsh sunlight like the fangs of hunting wolves. Honovi's keen eyes caught the movement first. His weathered hand tapped twice against the cup's rim, a soft metallic ping that might have seemed accidental to careless ears. The young woman's fingers instinctively echoed the rhythm against her torn skirt, and their gazes locked across the precious water as understanding passed between them. Without a word, he set down his cup and grasped her wrist not roughly, but with the firm pressure of someone who understood that hesitation between heartbeats could mean the difference between life and death. "Behind the stones," he said quietly, pulling her into the scant shelter offered by the windmill's crumbling foundation. They pressed against the sun-warmed adobe, their bodies close enough that he could feel the rapid flutter of her heart against his ribs. Her breathing came quick and shallow with fear, but her hands remained steady as she clutched a jagged piece of limestone from the deteriorating mortar. "I am Eliza Bauer," she whispered, her lips close to his ear. "Those men, they ride for Silas Murdoch. They've come to drag me back to his ranch." Honovi's jaw tightened at the mention of that name. Silas Murdoch owned half the water rights in the territory through methods that had nothing to do with honest purchase and everything to do with forged documents, intimidation, and violence. "Why do they hunt you?" Honovi asked, though he could guess the answer from the bruise on her neck and the fear that haunted her storm-gray eyes. "I fled his corrals yesterday morning," Eliza said, her voice gaining strength. "After they killed our cattle when Papa couldn't pay the water fees. Made me work the horses to settle what they called our debt. The foreman, Jake Thornton." She touched the bruise on her throat with trembling fingers. "I won't go back. I'd rather die in this desert than return to that place." The lead rider's voice cracked across the desert air like a bullwhip. "Eliza Bauer, come out, girl, and make this easy on yourself. Mr. Murdoch's got work waiting for you." Deputy Wade Coulter sat his horse with arrogant ease. At 35, he had the lean build of someone who lived by violence, with pale eyes that held all the warmth of winter moonlight on fresh graves. The badge pinned to his vest carried the authority of law, but everyone in 3 counties knew it could be bought for the price of a good horse. From deeper within the windmill's foundation came a sound that might have been wind whistling through cracks in the stones, but Honovi's trained ear caught the deliberate rhythm of controlled breathing. Someone else shared their refuge. That's when another voice emerged from the windmill's hidden depths, speaking with the authority of a man who had faced down cavalry charges and lived to forge horseshoes in peacetime. "That's far enough, Coulter." Felix Bauer emerged from the shadows like something carved from the very stones themselves. At 47, he was built like a draft horse. Broad shoulders and thick arms, developed by 20 years at the forge. His leather apron was dark with old soot, and in his massive grip he wielded a pair of red-hot tongs that glowed like coals. "Leave now," he commanded in English, thick with Bavarian accent. The tongs hissed as he brandished them, droplets of water from the seep turning to steam where they fell. "Felix Bauer should have known we'd find you lurking around here like some cave-dwelling hermit. Step aside, old man. We've got no quarrel with you." "Any quarrel with my niece is a quarrel with me," Felix replied, stepping fully into the sunlight. Here, Honovi noticed something significant, and the way Coulter's eyes narrowed when he looked at Felix, not with casual dismissal, but with particular hatred reserved for those who had once been trusted and had somehow betrayed that trust. The Lakota Warrior filed this observation away, sensing deeper currents beneath the surface. That's when Honovi made his presence known. Rising from concealment like an avenging spirit, he drew his bowstring to full extension in one fluid motion. The steel-tipped arrow was aimed directly at Coulter's black heart. The woman made her choice. Honovi said his English precise despite his native features. "Honor it." For a moment that stretched like pulled wire, the tableau held. Then Coulter's youngest rider made the decision for all of them, drawing his revolver and triggering a wild shot in Honovi's direction. Honovi's response was immediate and devastating. His arrow took the shooter through the shoulder, spinning him from his saddle to land hard in the muddy seep with a splash and a scream. The second rider wheeled his horse and spurred toward Honovi, but the Lakota Warrior was already moving, rolling aside, and coming up with his knife in hand. Coulter fired twice with his Colt and the heavy .44 cap and ball rounds chewing chunks from the windmill's wooden frame. But Honovi had vanished into the maze of shadow and stone. For a moment, an eerie silence descended, broken only by the wounded man's groans. Felix stepped forward with his tongue still glowing. "You've seen what my friend can do with a bow, Coulter. Imagine what I can do with these." Eliza emerged from cover, her limestone weapon clutched in one hand, and something that might have been hope flickering in her gray eyes. "Tell Murdoch I won't be coming back," she called. "Tell him he can find himself another slave." Coulter's face flushed red with rage and embarrassment. "This ain't over, girl," he snarled, hauling his wounded companion across the saddle. "Murdoch's got a long reach and a longer memory." As Coulter retreated with his wounded man, the three unlikely allies took stock of their situation. They had won this encounter, but everyone present understood it was merely the opening move in a much larger game. "Eliza, child, what have you brought down on us?" Felix said, his accent thick with emotion. She straightened her shoulders, suddenly looking older than her 19 years. From her torn dress, she produced a broken knife hilt, its silver surface etched with elegant letters, FB. "I found this in our wagon after they came," she said. "After they burned everything and killed Papa and Mama. Your mark, Uncle Felix, your steel in their hands." Felix's weathered face went ashen. The tongs slipped from his nerveless fingers to clatter on the stone foundation. But there was something else in his expression, not just horror, but recognition. "And guilt?" "Mein Gott," he whispered. "I made that blade for Murdoch's men 3 months ago. They said it was for cutting rope and leather-working cattle." He paused, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "But it was not the first thing I made for them." Honovi stepped closer, sensing the weight of confession in the older man's words. "What else?" Felix's hands shook as he retrieved the fallen tongs. "Horseshoes, wagon parts, tools for branding cattle. I thought I was just a blacksmith making honest goods for paying customers. But some of those brands, they were for cattle that didn't belong to Murdoch." "You worked for him," Eliza said, the words falling like stones into still water. "Yeah," Felix admitted, unable to meet her eyes. "For 2 years I worked for him, made the tools he used to steal from honest folk. But there was more." His voice cracked with shame. "When I first came to this territory, I was desperate, broke. Murdoch offered me work, good money. He asked me to do one small thing, forge a signature on a land deed. Just one signature. I told myself it was harmless, that no one would be hurt." The confession hung in the air, like smoke from a poison fire. "That signature," Felix continued, his voice barely audible. "It was the first forgery in what became his empire of lies. Everything that followed, all the stolen land, all the murdered families, it started with my hand guiding that pen." Eliza stared at her uncle, struggling to reconcile the broken man before her with the crime he was confessing. But Honovi, who had seen how guilt could eat a man alive from the inside, stepped forward. "Your hands shaped the weapon," he said to Felix, his tone neither accusatory nor absolving. "But you did not guide its use. The blood guilt belongs to those who perverted your craft for their own evil purposes." Eliza turned to face the Lakota warrior fully. "Teach me," she said again, her voice stronger now. "Teach me to stop grasping hands before they can take what isn't theirs." Honovi studied her face in the harsh morning light, noting the determined set of her jaw despite the obvious exhaustion. He knelt beside the seep and began tearing a strip from his buckskin shirt. "Give me your hands," he said quietly. Eliza extended her injured fingers without hesitation, and Honovi examined the cuts and scrapes with the practiced eye of someone who had tended many wounds. His touch was gentle but impersonal as he began binding the worst of the damage. "Fighting with hands begins with the whole body," he said as he worked his voice, taking on the formal cadence of instruction passed down through generations of warriors. "Like the great oak that bends but does not break in the storm, you must learn to root yourself in the earth while keeping your spirit free to move. Feet give you balance and power. They are your connection to the strength of the world beneath us." As he wrapped the makeshift bandages, their faces came close together, and Eliza caught the scent of sage smoke and wind-cured leather that clung to his skin. His fingers were surprisingly gentle for hands that could draw a bow with deadly accuracy. Eyes show you where to strike before your enemy knows it himself. Hanovi continued, his voice growing softer, more intimate. The hawk does not hunt by watching the grass move. She watches the mouse's eyes seize the moment of fear that comes before flight. Breath keeps you calm when blood runs hot and death walks close. In battle, the warrior who controls his breathing controls his fate. "Why help me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't know me, owe me nothing." Hanavi's gaze flicked to the ceremonial headdress resting against the windmill's base, its eagle feathers stirring in the desert breeze. "My chief taught me that strength shared makes the tribe stronger," he replied. "He would not forgive me if I let cruelty flourish in my sight when I had the power to stop it. And—" he paused, his eyes growing distant. "I had a sister once. She would have been about your age now if the spotted sickness had not taken her 3 winters past. Her name was Ayanna Eternal Blossom. She had your courage, your fire." The admission hung between them like a bridge built of shared loss and understanding. Eliza felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the desert sun. Their moment was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. A lone rider was approaching at a steady canter, moving with the easy confidence of someone who belonged in this landscape. Jonas Pike was 53 years old, his hair silver as winter grass and his face weathered by decades of frontier hardship. The battered Sharps rifle across his saddle looked older than statehood, but had obviously been maintained with loving care. "Felix," Jonas called as he reined in his horse. "Saw the smoke from your forge, figured you might be hiding out here." His gaze took in the churned mud, the blood stains, and the arrow shaft protruding from a nearby rock. "Looks like Coulter found you first." "Jonas," Felix replied, relief evident in his voice. "Yeah, they came looking for Eliza. We sent them away, but they will return with more men." Jonas dismounted and approached the group, his movements careful but purposeful. "Miss Bauer," he said, touching the brim of his weather-beaten hat. "Mighty sorry about your folks. They were good people." "You knew my parents?" Eliza asked. "Knew them well. Your pa helped me repair my plow last spring, wouldn't take payment for it." Jonas's expression darkened. "But I got something you folks need to see. Something that might just change the whole game." He reached into his worn vest and withdrew a folded document, its edges yellowed with age and handling. But as he moved, Eliza caught sight of something else. A second document, this one bearing the unmistakable blue seal of the United States Army. "Found this blowing across my property day before yesterday," Jonas said, handing over the first document. "Thought it was waste paper until I took a closer look." Hanovi accepted the document and unfolded it carefully. "This is a deed," he said slowly. "For the Dusty Fork community well, dated 8 months ago." "Look at the purchase price," Jonas suggested. Eliza peered over Hanovi's shoulder, their faces close together as they studied the document. $1, she read aloud. "Silas Murdoch purchased the Dusty Fork community well from the estate of Harrison Wade for the sum of $1. "Harrison Wade," Felix repeated. "Coulter's father. Died last spring of the lung fever." Jonas nodded grimly. "And Harrison Wade never owned that well in the first place." He withdrew the second document from his vest. Here's the original Army order establishing the well back in '65. Public watering station for emigrants and freight wagons heading west." Hanovi examined the military document with growing interest. The orders were clear: establish and maintain a public water source at Dusty Fork, for the use of all travelers, regardless of race, creed, or ability to pay. "Where did you get this?" Honovi asked. Jonas's weathered face creased in what might have been a smile. 20 years of faithful service earns a man certain privileges. When I mustered out in '68, I kept copies of orders that might prove important later. Colonel Morrison was a good officer, believed in treating folks fair. He'd be mighty unhappy to know his orders were being perverted for private gain. "Morrison?" Eliza asked. "Major General James Morrison now. Heard tell he's been appointed as a federal land examiner with the U.S. Land Office operating out of Denver. If anyone has the authority to break Murdoch's stranglehold on this territory, it's him." Thunder rumbled overhead. Still distant, the storm building slowly. The first fat raindrops began to fall, precious moisture that would briefly turn the dust to mud. "We need to reach Denver," Honovi said, folding both documents carefully and tucking them inside his buckskin shirt. "These documents could be the key to breaking Murdoch's monopoly, but only if we can get them to Morrison before Coulter returns with reinforcements." "Denver's 200 miles through hostile country," Felix pointed out. "We'd be riding with targets on our backs the whole way." Jonas was already checking his rifle and ammunition. "I'll guide you as far as the territorial road. After that, you're on your own. Got a wife and 5 children waiting at home." Eliza looked from her uncle to the Lakota Warrior, weighing their options. The smart thing would be to wait out the storm in relative safety. But something inside her had changed during the brief battle. She was tired of running, tired of being prey. "I vote we go," she said firmly. "I'm done hiding. If there's a chance to end this nightmare, I say we take it." As they prepared for the dangerous journey ahead, Honovi drew Eliza aside for more instruction. The brief battle had shown him that she possessed natural instincts for survival, but instincts alone would not be enough. "Stand here," he instructed. "Feet shoulder-width apart, weight on the balls of your feet. Like the young pine that grows on the cliff face, rooted but ready to sway with the wind. Always ready to move, always ready to strike or retreat." Eliza positioned herself as directed, and Honovi circled her slowly. Noting the way she held her shoulders at the unconscious tension that spoke of muscles held ready for flight. "Better," he said. "Now raise your hands. Not like sport, this is survival. Hands up to protect your face and throat, the places where a single strike can end the fight. Elbows in to guard your ribs, where broken bones can steal your breath, like winter steals the warmth from an unguarded fire." As he demonstrated the movements with fluid grace, Eliza watched intently, committing each detail to memory with desperate focus. "When someone grabs you," Honovi continued, "your first thought must be escape, not battle. The rabbit does not try to outfight the wolf, she uses speed and cunning to find freedom. Twist away from the thumb, it's the weakest part of any grip, like the broken branch that cannot hold weight. Step toward an attacker, not away. Get close, and they cannot use their reach advantage, cannot bring their full strength to bear, like the bow that cannot be drawn at close quarters. Now you try," Honovi said, stepping back. "Show me how you would break free from a grip on your wrist." Eliza moved awkwardly at first, but as she repeated the motion, something began to click. By the 5th repetition, she was moving with something approaching natural grace. "Good," Honovi said, genuine approval in his voice. "You learn quickly. Fear can be a teacher if you let it sharpen your mind, instead of clouding it, like the storm that makes the tree stronger by testing its roots." The storm was building in earnest now. Lightning split the sky with brilliant intensity, followed by crashes of thunder that shook the windmill's foundations. They gathered their meager possessions and mounted their horses. Jonas had brought extra animals from his farm. The journey that followed was a nightmare of mud lightning and the constant fear of flash floods. The creek bed they followed for cover began to run with muddy water that rose steadily as the storm intensified. By the time they had traveled 2 miles, the water was knee-deep on their horses and rising fast. Jonas called a halt, his face grim. "Creek's getting dangerous," he shouted over the thunder. "We'll have to strike overland from here, try to reach the bridge before the flash flood hits." They turned their horses up the slippery bank toward higher ground. It was then that disaster struck. As they crested the bank, a new sound reached their ears, the deep rumble of a flash flood racing down the creek bed, carrying with it debris from the upper watershed. But their relief at escaping the flood was short-lived. Silhouetted against the lightning-torn sky, a group of riders appeared on the ridge ahead. Coulter and his reinforcements, at least 8 men this time, positioned to cut off their escape route. "Ambush!" Jonas shouted, spurring his horse toward a cluster of rocks. They were waiting for us. The first rifle shots cracked across the storm muzzle flashes bright in the darkness. Bullets whined through the air around them, some striking stone with showers of sparks. Honovi's bow sang as he returned fire, his arrows invisible in the storm, but deadly accurate. One of Coulter's men screamed and toppled from his horse. But the odds were still against them, 8 against 4, and their enemies held the high ground. It was then that betrayal revealed itself. One of the riders with Coulter spurred his horse down the slope, and as lightning illuminated his face, Eliza gasped in recognition. "No, Martin Hendricks." She breathed, naming their nearest neighbor, a man her father had helped plant crops just last spring. Hendricks reined in his horse just outside rifle range. "Sorry, Eliza, Murdoch's got my water rights too. Said he'd give them back if I helped bring you in. Told them about the old military road, knew you'd have to come this way." The betrayal hit Eliza like a physical blow, but anger quickly replaced hurt. "Give me a gun," she said to Jonas, her voice cutting through the storm with cold determination. Jonas hesitated, then drew a second revolver from his belt, a .36 caliber Navy Colt. "It's got a heavy trigger pull," he warned. "Point it like you're pointing your finger squeeze, slow and steady." The battle resumed with renewed fury. Jonas's sharps began to take its toll, the heavy bullets capable of dropping a man at ranges that made revolvers useless. Honovi's arrows continued to find their marks with deadly precision. But when one of the deputies broke from cover and charged their position on horseback, Eliza stood calmly in the driving rain and shot him from the saddle with her first shot. The bullet took the man high in the chest, spinning him around, before he crashed into the rocks. The moment the gunshot echoed across the storm-torn landscape, something fundamental shifted inside Eliza. She stared at the fallen man, watching the rain wash the blood from his still form, and felt a cold emptiness settle in her chest. The weight of the smoking revolver in her hand seemed to anchor her to a reality she barely recognized. The sight of a 19-year-old farm girl coolly gunning down a mounted attacker seemed to break something in Coulter's remaining men. The deputy tried to rally them, but the growing casualty count was undermining his authority. Then the flash flood provided an unexpected complication. The bridge ahead, their only route to the territorial road, began to shake under the assault of logs and debris carried by the muddy torrent. "The bridge!" Felix shouted. "It's going to go." A massive cottonwood tree slammed into the wooden structure, and they could see the timbers beginning to buckle. In minutes, their only route to safety would be swept away. "We have to run for it," Jonas called, spurring his horse toward the shaking bridge. "Now, before it collapses." They broke from cover in a desperate sprint, bullets whining overhead. Honovi reached the bridge first, his horse dancing nervously as the structure swayed beneath them. One by one, the others followed Jonas, Felix, and finally Eliza. They were halfway across when disaster struck. A second massive log slammed into the bridge's central span with the force of a cannonball. The timbers shrieked and began to give way, opening gaps that revealed the churning torrent below. Eliza's horse, already spooked, shied violently at the sound of splintering wood. The animal stumbled, and horse and rider plunged through the gap into the flood-swollen creek below. The water was shockingly cold and powerful beyond imagination. Eliza felt herself torn from the saddle and swept downstream, the current so strong that swimming was impossible. Her waterlogged dress dragged at her limbs, threatening to pull her under. Above the roar of the flood, she heard Honovi's voice calling her name. Through the churning water, she caught a glimpse of him diving from the bridge, his buckskin shirt making him look like some spirit of the storm as he plunged into the deadly current. The next few minutes passed in a blur of muddy water, gasping breaths and desperate struggle. She felt Honovi's strong arm close around her waist, pulling her against the current toward a partially submerged tree. "Hold on to me." He gasped, water streaming from his long black hair as he fought to maintain their grip on the slippery branches. The current's too strong to fight. Like the wise fish that swims with the river's flow, we must let it carry us downstream and choose our moment to reach the bank. Eliza nodded, too exhausted to speak. She wrapped her arms around Honovi's shoulders, feeling the steady strength of his muscles as he fought to keep them both afloat. In that moment of crisis, with death rushing past them in the form of uprooted trees and boulders, she felt safer in his arms than she had since her parents' murder. They clung to each other as the flood carried them nearly a mile downstream, before finally depositing them on a muddy bank. Both were bruised, exhausted, and half drowned, but alive. The precious documents were still safe in Honovi's waterproof pouch. "The others," she gasped, pushing wet hair from her eyes. "Safe," Honovi replied, pointing to where Jonas and Felix could be seen on the opposite bank, waving to show they had survived. "The flood separated us, but they know where we're going." As they helped each other to their feet, both soaked and shivering, Eliza became acutely aware of how close they were standing. Honovi's arms were still around her waist, supporting her weight, and she could feel the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "Thank you," she whispered. "You saved my life." Honovi's dark eyes met hers, and for a moment the world seemed to shrink to just the two of them. "You would have done the same for me," he said simply, but there was something deeper in his voice. Their moment was interrupted by the sound of horses splashing through muddy ground. The flood had bought them time, but Coulter's men would find another way across eventually. "We need to keep moving," Honovi said reluctantly, releasing his hold on her. "Denver is still 150 miles away, and Murdoch will have every road watched by now." They began walking toward higher ground, and their waterlogged boots squelching in the mud. The storm was finally beginning to break, the thunder growing more distant, and the rain settling into a steady drizzle. "How do we reach Denver if every road is watched?" Eliza asked. Honovi was quiet for a moment, considering their options. "There are older paths. Trails that my people have used for generations, paths that follow the natural flow of the land, like water following stone. Harder traveling, but less chance of being seen." As they climbed toward the mesa above, the full magnitude of their situation began to sink in. They were alone on foot in hostile territory, with no supplies beyond what they carried. Their enemies had horses' numbers and local knowledge. The odds of reaching Denver alive seemed impossibly small. But as they crested the ridge and looked back at the swollen creek below, Eliza felt something she hadn't experienced since her parents' death hope. They had survived the flood-escaped Coulter's ambush and still possessed the evidence that could bring down Murdoch's empire. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep fighting. "Tell me about your sister," she said as they walked, wanting to know more about this man who had risked everything for a stranger. Honovi was quiet for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he spoke, his voice soft with memory. Ayana was 12 when the soldiers came to our village. Not to fight, we were at peace then. They brought gifts, blankets, and food, said they wanted to help us through the winter. His jaw tightened. The blankets carried the spotted sickness. Half our people died before the snow melted like leaves falling from a tree touched by an early frost. I'm sorry. Eliza said the inadequate words, all she could offer. She fought it longer than most. Kept asking me to tell her stories about the old days when our people were free to follow the buffalo across the Great Plains like clouds following the wind. Even dying, she wanted to hear about hope. He glanced at Eliza. You remind me of her. Not in looks, but in spirit. The way you refuse to give up even when everything seems lost, like the prairie grass that bends low before the storm, but always rises again when the wind passes. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, following a barely visible path that wound through the broken country above the flood plain. The landscape was harsh and unforgiving, all red rock and thorny scrub, but there was a stark beauty to it that spoke to something deep in Eliza's soul. As the sun climbed higher, they began to see signs of pursuit. Dust clouds on distant ridges, the occasional glint of sunlight on metal, the faint sound of horses carried on the wind. Murdoch's men were out in force, spreading across the territory like a net. They're trying to box us in, Honovi observed, studying the terrain ahead. Drive us toward the main road where they can overwhelm us with numbers. Then we don't go where they expect, Eliza replied, surprising herself with the tactical thinking. We go where they can't follow. Honovi smiled, the first genuine smile she had seen from him. You're learning to think like a warrior. They changed direction, heading into rougher country where horses would be useless. The going was harder, climbing over broken rock and scrambling through narrow canyons, but they could move more quietly and leave less trail. It was in one of these canyons that they encountered other travelers, a small group of Lakota warriors, part of a band that had refused to go to the reservations. Honovi spoke to them in their own language, explaining their mission and asking for guidance. The leader, an older man with scars marking his weathered face, listened gravely before responding. When the conversation ended, Honovi turned to Eliza with something like relief in his expression. They will help, he said. Not directly, they cannot risk open war with the white authorities. But they will provide horses and supplies and safe passage through their territory. Within an hour, they were mounted again and moving swiftly through country that Eliza would never have believed passable. The Lakota guides led them along ancient trails, paths worn by countless generations of hunters and warriors, invisible to white eyes, but clear as roads to those who knew how to read the land. For 2 days they traveled this way, covering ground at a pace that would have been impossible on the main roads. They slept in hidden camps, ate simple meals of jerky and prairie bread, and gradually left the immediate danger behind. On their second night, as they sat around a small fire in a sheltered canyon, the weight of what had happened finally caught up with Eliza. She stared into the flames, her hands wrapped around a cup of bitter coffee, and felt the full impact of taking a human life settle over her like a heavy blanket. I killed a man, she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the crackling flames. I never thought I could do such a thing. Honovi looked up from where he was checking his bow, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. What troubles you most about it? The question surprised her with its directness. She had expected comfort or absolution, not this gentle probing of her conscience. I'm not sure I feel what I should feel. Shouldn't I be horrified? Shouldn't I be unable to sleep, to eat, Instead, I just feel empty, cold, like something inside me died along with him. Hanovi set aside his bow and moved closer to where she sat. Among my people, when a warrior takes his first life in battle, he undergoes a purification ceremony. Not because killing is evil, sometimes it is necessary like the wolf that hunts to feed her cubs, but because taking a life changes the one who takes it, and that change must be acknowledged and honored. He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. The cold you feel, it is not the death of your soul. It is the birth of understanding. You have learned that you are capable of things you never imagined, both terrible and necessary. This knowledge will be with you always, like a scar that tells the story of survival. How do you bear it? Eliza asked. The weight of it. By remembering why it was necessary. By honoring those you protect as much as those you destroy. By never taking a life carelessly or in anger, but only when all other paths are closed. His voice grew softer. And by sharing the burden with others who understand so that you do not carry it alone. Eliza felt something ease in her chest, not complete healing, but the beginning of acceptance. Thank you, she said simply. They sat in comfortable silence after that, watching the fire burn low, while the night sounds of the desert created a symphony around them. When they finally banked the coals and prepared to sleep, Eliza felt less alone than she had since her parents' death. On the third morning, as they approached the territorial border, their luck ran out. A patrol of cavalry troopers, blue-uniformed men on government horses, intercepted them at a river crossing. Hold there, the sergeant called, raising his carbine. State your business in this territory. Hanovi and Eliza exchanged glances. They could fight, but these were federal soldiers, not Murdoch's hired guns. Attacking them would make them criminals in the eyes of the law. We're traveling to Denver. Eliza called back, deciding that partial truth was their best option. To testify before a federal land examiner with the U.S. Land Office about water rights fraud. The sergeant rode closer, his eyes taking in their trail-worn appearance and mixed-race company. You're the ones Murdoch's been looking for. Got a bounty posted in every town between here and the Colorado line. Eliza's heart sank. If even the army was looking for them, their chances of reaching Denver seemed hopeless. But the sergeant's next words surprised her. Of course, that bounty's only good in territorial jurisdiction, where federal troops answer to Washington, not local land barons. He leaned forward in his saddle. Heard tell there's been some irregularities in the water rights business. Some folks in Washington are mighty interested in getting to the bottom of it. Hope flickered again. You'll let us pass. More than that, we'll escort you to the territorial line. After that, you're on your own, but at least you'll have a fair start. The cavalry escort proved invaluable. With federal troops riding beside them, no one dared interfere with their passage. They made good time on the main road, covering in one day what would have taken 2 through the Badlands. But at the territorial border, the soldiers had to turn back. The sergeant shook hands with both of them before departing. Denver's still 50 miles, he warned. Murdoch's influence doesn't stop at territorial lines. He's got friends and business partners all through Colorado. Watch yourselves. They pressed on alone, following the well-traveled road toward the territorial capital. The country here was different, more settled with farms and ranches spread across the rolling hills. But civilization brought its own dangers. Word of the bounty had spread, and they could feel hostile eyes watching from every settlement they passed. It was at a way station 20 miles from Denver that they finally ran into serious trouble. The proprietor, a gap-toothed man named Briggs, recognized them immediately. Well, he said, his hand dropping to the shotgun behind his counter. Eliza Bauer and her Indian friend. Heard there's good money waiting for whoever brings you in. Honovi's hand moved toward his knife, but Eliza stopped him with a gesture. She had been thinking about this moment, planning for it during the long miles of their journey. There is, she agreed, her voice calm and conversational. Question is, who's paying better, Murdoch for delivering us alive, or the federal government for the evidence we're carrying? Briggs hesitated, greed warring with caution in his narrow features. What evidence? Eliza withdrew one of the documents from Honovi's pouch, not the original, but a copy Jonas had made before they left Dusty Fork. Proof that Murdoch's water rights are fraudulent. Forged documents, illegal transfers stolen from the United States Army. The kind of evidence that federal prosecutors pay handsomely for. She placed the paper on the counter where Briggs could see it, noting how his eyes widened as he read the official seals and legal language. But she could see the calculation in his expression, the weighing of immediate profit against uncertain future gain. Course. She continued, her voice taking on a harder edge. If you'd rather take Murdoch's blood money, you might want to consider what happens when this all comes out in federal court. When people learn who helped a murderer and a fraud keep his victims silent. When the families of dead homesteaders start looking for someone to blame besides Murdoch himself. She leaned forward slightly, her gray eyes fixed on his with uncomfortable intensity. You see, Mr. Briggs, I know what it's like to lose everything to Murdoch's greed. I know what it's like to watch your family die because of his water rights. And I know I'm not the only one. There are a lot of angry people out there, people who've lost everything they loved to that man's schemes. Briggs shifted uncomfortably, his hand still hovering near the shotgun. You threatening me, girl? I'm offering you a choice, Eliza replied smoothly. Help us reach Denver with this evidence, and you'll be remembered as someone who stood up for justice. Help Murdoch silence us, and you'll be remembered as an accomplice to murder. Simple as that. The negotiation continued for another tense 10 minutes, with Honovi ready to fight, and Eliza gambling everything on her ability to appeal to the man's self-interest rather than his immediate greed. She painted a vivid picture of the rewards that would come to those who helped bring down Murdoch's empire, while subtly emphasizing the dangers of being on the wrong side when federal justice finally arrived. In the end, avarice won out over caution. But it was the long-term calculation rather than immediate profit that swayed him. Briggs not only let them go, but provided fresh horses and supplies for the final push to Denver, muttering about getting in on the ground floor of what was sure to be a profitable outcome. As they rode away from the way station, Honovi shook his head in amazement. How did you know he would choose future wealth over present coin? I didn't, Eliza admitted. But I've learned something about people since all this started. Most of them aren't evil, just scared and trying to survive. If you can show them a path that serves their interests while also serving justice, they'll usually take it. They reached Denver as the sun was setting on their 4th day of travel since leaving Dusty Fork. The territorial capital was larger than anything Eliza had ever seen, a bustling city of nearly 10,000 souls with gas streetlights, telegraph wires, and all the trappings of civilization. After the harsh wilderness they had traversed, it seemed like another world entirely. Finding Major General Morrison proved easier than expected. The federal land examiner with the U.S. Land Office maintained offices in the territorial courthouse, and his reputation for honesty had made him a popular figure among the city's residents. Morrison himself was a tall, straight-backed man of 50, with iron-gray hair and piercing blue eyes that had once stared down Confederate cavalry charges. When they were ushered into his office, He listened to their story with the focused attention of a career military officer accustomed to making life-and-death decisions based on incomplete information. "Remarkable," he said, after examining the documents they had brought. "Absolutely remarkable. Do you have any idea what you've risked to bring me this evidence?" "Justice," Eliza replied simply, "and the hope that good people might be able to return to their homes." Morrison studied the papers for several more minutes, his expression growing increasingly grim. "This deed purporting to transfer ownership of the Dusty Fork, well, it's a forgery. A very good forgery, but a forgery nonetheless. The Territorial Land Office has no record of any such transfer." He pointed to specific sections of the documents explaining the legal irregularities that proved their fraudulent nature. More importantly, the well was established by Army order as a public facility. Murdoch has been operating an illegal monopoly for 2 years. "So you can stop him?" Eliza asked. "I can file federal charges," Morrison replied. "But proving them in court will require testimony from witnesses who have been intimidated into silence. And Murdoch has considerable influence. He won't go down without a fight." Over the next several days, Morrison worked tirelessly to build a case that would stand up in federal court. Eliza and Honovi provided detailed testimony about Murdoch's methods, while telegraph messages went out across the territory summoning other witnesses. During this time, as they waited in Denver for the case to develop, Eliza found herself grappling with questions that went beyond simple justice. Late one evening, as she and Honovi walked along the Platte River that flowed through the city, she voiced the thoughts that had been troubling her. "When this is over," she said, watching the moonlight dance on the water, "when Murdoch is brought to justice and the water rights are restored, what then? What happens to people like us?" Honovi was quiet for a moment, considering her question. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I can never go back to being the farm girl I was before all this started. That person is gone dead as surely as my parents are dead. But I don't know what I'm becoming in her place." She turned to face him, her eyes reflecting the moonlight. "Do you ever feel that way? Like you're caught between two worlds, not fully belonging to either one?" "Every day since I left my people to carry Chief White Thunder's war bonnet to the sacred places," Honovi admitted. "I was raised to be a warrior in a world where warriors are no longer needed. Trained to fight enemies who are now contained on reservations or fled to Canada. The skills that made me valuable to my tribe are useless in this new world of laws and courts and federal inspectors." They walked in silence for a while, both grappling with the fundamental changes that recent events had wrought in their lives. Finally, Eliza spoke again. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing. Maybe the world needs people who understand both the old ways and the new. People who can bridge the gap between what was and what's coming." Honovi stopped walking and turned to face her fully. "Is that what you think we're doing, building bridges?" "I don't know," Eliza said honestly. "But I know I want to find out. With you, if you'll have me." Slowly, a picture emerged of systematic fraud and violence spanning several years. Homesteaders who had been driven from their land began coming forward, emboldened by the presence of federal authority. Even some of Murdoch's former employees, disgusted by what they had been forced to do, offered to testify in exchange for immunity. But Murdoch was not sitting idle. Reports came in of armed men gathering at his ranch, hired guns, and desperate outlaws, attracted by the promise of easy money. Word spread that he had put a dead or alive bounty on both Eliza and Honovi, making them targets for every bounty hunter and criminal in the territory. "He's planning something," Morrison warned during one of their evening strategy sessions. "A man like Murdoch doesn't build an empire through fraud and violence, only to surrender it quietly. He'll make a play to silence you before this comes to trial. During these tense days of preparation, Felix finally arrived in Denver, having made his own difficult journey through the aftermath of the flood. When he was reunited with Eliza, the reunion was emotional but strained. The weight of his confession still hung between them, and both struggled to find their footing in this new dynamic. It was Honovi who initiated the conversation that needed to happen. One evening, he approached Felix as the older man sat alone in the hotel lobby, staring into a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched. "You carry a heavy burden," Honovi said, settling into the chair across from him. Felix looked up with eyes that seemed to have aged years in the past week. "Yeah, I do. The weight of knowing that my hands helped build the evil that destroyed my own family. Among my people," Honovi said carefully, "we believe that a man's worth is not measured by his past mistakes, but by what he does to make amends for them. You could have remained silent about your role in Murdoch's schemes. You could have let others bear the cost of bringing him to justice. But I didn't," Felix said bitterly. "I confessed because I couldn't live with the guilt anymore. That's not nobility, that's selfishness." "Perhaps," Honovi agreed, "but the result is the same. Your testimony will help convict a man who has caused great suffering. Your knowledge of his methods will help ensure that his victims receive justice. Does the purity of your motives matter more than the good that comes from your actions?" Felix was quiet for a long moment, finally taking a sip of his whiskey. "How does your people deal with such burdens? This weight of having done wrong?" "Through ceremony and community," Honovi replied. "We believe that holding guilt in isolation only poisons the soul. Better to share the burden with others, to let the community help bear the weight while you work to make things right. And if the community rejects you, if your own family cannot look at you without seeing your sins." Honovi glanced toward the stairs leading to the rooms where Eliza was resting. "Then you must earn your way back into their trust one day at a time, one right action at a time. There is no quick healing for such wounds, but healing is possible if you are willing to do the work." Morrison's prediction proved accurate. On their 7th day in Denver, word came that a large group of armed riders had been seen approaching the city. Murdoch himself was leading them along with what remained of his private army. "He's coming here?" Eliza asked, unable to believe that even Murdoch would be brazen enough to attack federal officials in the territorial capital. "He's desperate," Morrison replied grimly. "A cornered animal will do things that defy logic, and he's probably counting on his political connections to protect him from the consequences." The final confrontation came the next morning in the plaza, before the territorial courthouse. Murdoch rode into Denver, at the head of 30 armed men, his face set in lines of cold determination. He had the look of a man who had decided that if his empire was going to fall, he would take as many enemies with him as possible. Morrison was waiting for him, flanked by federal marshals and local law enforcement. The courthouse steps were lined with witnesses, homesteaders, townspeople, and territorial officials who had come to see justice finally served. Silas Murdoch. Morrison called his voice, carrying clearly across the plaza. "You're under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and violation of federal land laws. Surrender yourself and your men, and no one needs to get hurt." Murdoch's laugh was ugly and filled with contempt, but when he spoke, his words carried a chilling conviction that revealed the depth of his delusion. "You think a few pieces of paper can destroy what I've built?" he said, his voice carrying clearly across the plaza. "I didn't come to this God-forsaken territory to get rich, Morrison. I came to bring order to chaos, to impose civilization on a land ruled by savages and weaklings. Every deed I signed, every claim I staked, every man I killed it, was all in service of building something permanent, something that would last. He gestured broadly at the city around them, his eyes bright with fanatic fervor. Look around you, see the streets, the buildings, the prosperity. This didn't spring from the ground by magic. It was built by men like me, men willing to do what others wouldn't, to take what others were too weak to claim. You call it fraud. I call it manifest destiny. Morrison's expression remained calm, but his hand rested on his holstered revolver. And the families you destroyed, the children you made orphans. What do you call that? The price of progress. Murdoch replied without hesitation. Every civilization is built on the bones of those too weak to adapt. I didn't make the rules of this world, Morrison. I just understood them better than most. Last chance, Murdoch, Morrison said. Surrender peacefully or face the consequences. Murdoch's response was to draw his revolver and fire a shot into the air. I'll burn this whole damn city before I let you destroy what I've built. The battle that followed was brief but vicious. Murdoch's men, outnumbered and outgunned by federal forces, quickly found themselves in an untenable position. Some tried to flee, others attempted to fight their way out, but the outcome was never really in doubt. Honovi, armed with a rifle provided by the federal marshals, moved through the chaos with deadly efficiency. His warrior training served him well in the urban battlefield, and his shots found their marks with devastating accuracy. Eliza had positioned herself in the courthouse, watching through a window as the battle raged below. When she saw one of Murdoch's men trying to flank the federal position, she calmly took aim with her revolver and dropped him with a single shot. The fight was over in less than 10 minutes, leaving half of Murdoch's force dead or wounded and the rest in custody. Murdoch himself had taken refuge behind a water trough, his empire crumbling around him like a house built on sand. Morrison approached the defeated land baron with his service revolver drawn. Silas Murdoch, you're under arrest for armed insurrection against federal authority in addition to your previous charges. Murdoch looked up at him with eyes full of frustrated rage, but still burning with unshakable conviction. This isn't over, Morrison. Men like me built this country, and there will always be more of us. You can't stop progress with your courts and your laws. Perhaps, Morrison replied, but we can sure as hell try. The trial that followed was a sensation, drawing newspaper reporters from across the country. The evidence was overwhelming: forged documents, coerced testimony, and a pattern of violence that had terrorized an entire territory. Murdoch's political connections proved useless in the face of such comprehensive proof of wrongdoing. He was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, while his surviving associates received lesser terms. More importantly, his water monopoly was broken forever. The Dusty Fork well was restored to public use, and the families who had been driven from their land were able to return home. Felix, who had testified honestly about his own role in Murdoch's schemes, was granted immunity in exchange for his cooperation. The guilt that had eaten at him for years was finally lifted, replaced by the satisfaction of helping to bring his former employer to justice. Jonas Pike became something of a local hero, his role in preserving the crucial documents earning him recognition throughout the territory. He used his newfound fame to advocate for other homesteaders facing similar threats, becoming a voice for justice in the rapidly changing West. Martin Hendricks, who had also testified despite his earlier betrayal, worked tirelessly to make amends for his actions. He helped organize the effort to restore abandoned homesteads and was eventually forgiven by most of his neighbors, though the shame of his betrayal would follow him for the rest of his life. As the trial concluded and the immediate danger passed, Eliza found herself standing on the courthouse steps, watching the crowds of people celebrating in the plaza below. The weight of everything they had endured, the violence, The loss, the fear, the long journey through hostile territory settled over her like a heavy blanket. She thought of her parents buried in unmarked graves back in Dusty Fork. They would never see the justice that had finally been served, would never know that their sacrifice had not been in vain. The thought brought tears to her eyes, but they were tears of relief as much as sorrow. A hand touched her shoulder gently, and she turned to find Honovi beside her. He said nothing, but his presence was comfort enough. Together they watched the celebration continue below two survivors who had found something precious in the midst of tragedy. "It's over," she said finally. "This part is..." Honovi agreed. "But there will be other Murdochs, other places where justice needs champions. The work is never truly finished." Morrison approached them, his official demeanor softened by something that might have been paternal affection. "Miss Bauer, Mr. Honovi, I owe you both a debt of gratitude. Without your courage and determination, Murdoch's crimes might never have been exposed." He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier about people who can bridge different worlds. The West is changing rapidly, and that change needs guides, people who understand both the old ways and the new, who can help others navigate the transition." "What are you suggesting?" Eliza asked. "Federal agents," Morrison replied. "Traveling throughout the territories to investigate cases of fraud and corruption, to protect settlers from men like Murdoch, to ensure that the law applies equally to everyone, regardless of race or wealth or political connections." Eliza looked at Honovi, seeing her own thoughts reflected in his dark eyes. It would be dangerous work, taking them far from any hope of a settled life. But it would also be meaningful work, the kind that could make a real difference in people's lives. "We accept," she said without hesitation. Their wedding took place the following spring, in a ceremony that honored both of their traditions. Morrison performed the legal ceremony in his capacity as a federal marshal, while an elderly Lakota medicine man, who had traveled from the reservation, conducted the traditional rituals. Felix gave away the bride with tears in his eyes, his relationship with his niece slowly healing as they learned to build something new from the wreckage of their shared tragedy. Jonas Pike served as best man, his weathered face creased in a genuine smile as he watched two people he had come to love begin their life together. The celebration brought together an unlikely mix of people, federal officials and Indian leaders, homesteaders and former soldiers, all united in their respect for two people who had risked everything for justice. Even some of Murdoch's former victims attended, expressing their gratitude to the couple who had made their freedom possible. As the sun set over the Colorado plains and the celebration continued around them, Honovi and Eliza stood together at the edge of the gathering, watching the stars emerge in the vast sky above. She wore a simple white dress that had been her mother's, altered to fit her smaller frame, while he had traded his warrior's regalia for the practical clothes of a federal agent, though the eagle feather in his hair still marked his heritage with pride. "Are you happy?" he asked, taking her hand in his as they looked out over the land that had brought them together. "Yes," Eliza replied without hesitation. "More than I ever thought possible after everything that happened." "You?" Honovi considered the question seriously, as was his nature. Behind them, the sounds of celebration, continued laughter and music, the voices of friends who had become family. Before them stretched the vast expanse of the American West, full of promise and possibility. "I am content," he said finally, using the Lakota word that conveyed a deeper satisfaction than mere happiness. "My chief lies buried in the sacred places where his spirit can rest in peace. Justice has been served for those who could not speak for themselves. And I have found something I never expected to find, a home and someone to share it with." They stood together in comfortable silence, husband and wife, warrior and survivor. Two people who had found love in the midst of violence and built hope from the ashes of despair. Around them, the celebration continued into the night, marking not just their union, but the triumph of justice over oppression, of community over greed, of love over hatred. In the months and years that followed, they would travel throughout the territories as federal agents fighting fraud and corruption wherever it could be found. There would be times of danger and hardship, moments when their different backgrounds created challenges, periods when the prejudice of others made their lives difficult. But there would also be times of great joy, the birth of their children, who would grow up speaking both English and Lakota, comfortable in both worlds. The satisfaction of seeing justice done for those who had been wronged. The simple pleasure of building a life together based on mutual respect and genuine love. The West was indeed changing, as Morrison had predicted. The frontier was giving way to civilization and the old ways being replaced by law and order. But in that transition, there was still room for people who understood that justice was worth fighting for, that love could bridge any divide, and that hope could flourish even in the harshest of circumstances. Their story, which had begun at a windmill beside a precious seep of water, had become something larger, a testament to the power of courage in the face of oppression of love, in the midst of hatred of hope, in the darkest of times. And in the vast expanse of the American West, where the strong too often preyed upon the weak and justice was as scarce as water in the desert, it was a story that would be remembered long after the last of the frontier had passed into history.